Greg, nice to meet you.
Good to have you here, Nitin.
Yes.
Glad you made the time to come and visit.
Oh, I can't believe it's been a lot of Zoom calls and online discussions, which I think is okay, but this is nothing like this, yes. So thank you for inviting me to your place.
Lovely to have you here. Yeah.
Greg, I have a question actually, and the question is this, that your book, Paper Safe, it makes so much sense to me at a commercial level, at an operational level, at a regulatory level. And I think the message is very, very clear. Maybe the starting point is for you just to tell us what this book is all about, and then see where this goes from here. Yes.
Okay. So the primary rationale behind the book was what I perceived as a disconnect between process and purpose. So organisations would invest a lot of effort and energy in creating lots of safety paperwork, and then the organisation then struggled to demonstrate either what the purpose of the paperwork was, but more importantly, or not necessarily just the paperwork, the process. Was the process achieving the purpose it was designed to achieve? And I think there's been some more simplistic interpretations of the book, which says get rid of paperwork. And I think I'd like to think that the message is a bit more nuanced than that. It's not just to get rid of paperwork, although I do think there are lots of processes we can get rid of in safety. A lot of it's duplicitous. It's just overlaying bureaucracy on bureaucracy without any real need. But the real message of the book was, how do you know that your processes are achieving the outcome they're designed to achieve? And also, and this is probably more of a legal risk management perspective, but if you're not prepared to put the time and effort into understanding if your processes work, you're probably better off not having them. So rather than building mountains of checklists for your workers that you never really check and see if they're being done properly or if they work, don't have the checklists, because they're not adding any value and you just don't know what's in them.
Yes. Not only they're not adding any value, they're actually undermining both reputation as well as the legal aspects of it.
I think that's the risk, and this is the difficult. It's hard because you can't apply a one size fits all and say if you're not doing this you're creating legal risk, because you might not be. It might be that your people are paying close attention to the process and diligently understanding it and applying it. Okay. My experience tells me is that we don't know the answer to that question until something goes wrong. And it's not until something goes wrong, and when I say, and that's not even quite right, it's not until something goes wrong that a regulator comes and looks at it that we know the answer to that question. Because typically in our own organisations, when something goes wrong, we will look at the immediate circumstances around the incident, but we won't go back and look at the history of our process to see what that shows us. So it's not until something goes wrong and a regulator comes in and starts pulling it apart that we actually understand whether there's any alignment between our process and what we're trying to achieve. And so it's just sort of sitting in the background, ticking away like an unexploded bomb, waiting to go off, and we don't actually know what's in it. And so from my perspective, when you think about what does the gold standard look like, it's you have a process, the purpose or the objective of that process is well understood, people understand the process, and all of the supporting material as part of that process is all consistent and evidences compliance, and that's what we don't have. Now there are, the other part of it is whether the processes, even if they are done well, are inherently helpful. And I know you've spent time recently with Rob Long. Rob has strong views about what is good and bad. My views about what is good and bad are less tightly held. I do have some views, but they're less tightly held. But my conversation with people is, well, show me that it works for you. And you can take something as simple as a zero harm mantra in an organisation. It doesn't appeal to me personally. And we know there is plenty of literature that says it can be problematic, and we understand all of that. And I guess the challenge to organisations is to recognise all of the assumptions that underpin your processes and explore them. Does this process work for your organisation rather than a blanket? And I think we're seeing this a bit in safety too, the Safety Differently movement. So people will all say learning teams are great, as though that's a universal given. And it's not. You can have learning teams that are really good for an organisation, or even parts of an organisation might do them better than other parts. But to say everything in safety is universally and automatically a good idea is just, I don't think that's a defendable position. You have to understand, does it work for you as an organisation? And that's kind of the key message, I think, in PaperSafe. And I think one of the mechanics to try and do that is probably to remove stuff from the organisation that doesn't add value.
Right. And yes, you've already talked about it. So Greg, the message is clear, is very clear that the process must meet its purpose, right? Otherwise, there is very little in terms of value addition.
Yes. And I don't think safety is unique in that sense. You could apply the same to quality and environment and HR and any of those sort of management disciplines.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Yes, that makes sense. So, and it's you probably, a lot of people in the risk and safety world have read this book. I think a lot of people are convinced with the message. I still struggle to understand why is it that it makes so much sense at every level, commercial, operational. Why doing some things that don't add value is a very commercial question. Also, in some ways, it has an operational value. It makes a lot of legal sense to me, although I'm not a lawyer. But the question is, despite all these wonderful and robust arguments that you've put through, why is it so difficult for organizations to actually, or people to embrace this idea?
It's a funny one. I struggle with it even myself, advising clients. You always get a bit nervous saying, "Oh, you should take that away," because ultimately, if something goes wrong, everyone's quite happy to say, "Oh, Greg told us we should take that away." So there's a nervousness about it. It's interesting. I think the regulator has a role to play in this. So often, and this is very much in an Australian context, but the regulators are very much show us the documentation. So I think a lot of what we do is just there to satisfy regulators, and I think that's uncomfortable. And part of the problem, and again, this might be a bit Australian-centric, but I suspect it's broader, companies are very, very compliant to health and safety regulators. If a regulator comes in and says, we're going to issue you this improvement notice, or we require you to develop, you should have this checklist, we kind of just do it. We don't push back, we don't challenge, we don't argue the toss, and we end up building this mountain of stuff dictated to us by regulators. So I think that's part of it. I think there's a cultural issue, and you're probably as well qualified to speak to this as anybody. And it's something I've heard Professor Drew Ray talk about, this idea that if you're critical of anything in safety and you say we should get rid of that, then you're seen as anti-safety and you don't care. So that's, I think that really plays a part of it. And it's interesting. So again, Dave Proven and Drew Ray talk about creating this term safety clutter to try and create a safe space where you can have that conversation about things that don't add value. And I remember very early on in the piece, even before I wrote the book, talking about things like JHAs and those sort of frontline documents, and very often coming up against the argument that it's better to have something that doesn't work than to have nothing at all. Very often hearing that, and I'm thinking, oh, that's just, I just don't know where that comes from. But looking back with, probably another 10 or 15 years under my belt, I think it is, again, this idea of what Proven and Ray would talk about as demonstrated safety. We need to be able to show something. And it doesn't matter how many cases you put up and say, here's a decision, they didn't have any documented systems, they were able to defend the charge. Here's a decision, they had all the documented systems in the world, but they didn't align to the way work was performed, therefore they had no defence. And it's just, I think it's an emotive attachment to process. It's not necessarily rational or reasoned.
No, and you're absolutely right. There is an emotive aspect to it. But just going back to this idea of demonstrating safety through process, and you call it proving safety in the new book.
Yep.
So I think, I don't know what you think about it, but does demonstrating safety mean holding more documentation?
Ultimately, no. Ultimately, no, I don't think so. The documents, we'll go down a real rabbit warren here, so I'll try and be brief, but the documents are the start point of your conversation. So if you have a signed checklist, it's been an incident, involved a piece of equipment, there's a signed checklist. All the checklist is evidence of that somebody's completed a checklist. It's not evidence of their understanding of the equipment. It's not evidence of their understanding of the risks associated with the equipment. It's not even evidence that the equipment was fit and proper to use. So it's not, and all of that stuff, all of those questions, which are the actual questions that matter, are dealt with through witness interviews and cross-examination and further investigation. So you have a checklist that says everything's in good condition, and the objective evidence when the piece of equipment is looked at is that, well, it wasn't in good condition, it was missing things, that's what gets done. And then the question becomes, okay, is this improperly completed checklist, and this is terminology I use, does that represent a one-off departure from our system? So do we have a good system where people are trained and understood and they normally complete these things properly? Or is it evidence of systemic failure? And very often what you get is evidence of systemic failure. So a checklist was completed 6 weeks ago and it says this guard was missing off the equipment. And that goes in and nothing gets done about it, and all the checklists after that say the guard was in place. And that's surprisingly common in these sorts of incidents. And what we don't have is anybody organisationally going back and checking, here's a completed checklist, does this checklist represent the state of the equipment? What we measure and count is the number of checklists that have been completed. Yes, one's being done every day. And so that's the conversation about, if you're not prepared to put the time and effort in to understand if it's being done properly, don't do it at all. You could just as easily have a by exception reporting. So if something is wrong, then it gets reported, rather than this, here's a checklist to show it's been done. As an exercise in theory, you get exactly the same outcome. As you're not potentially creating a database of non-compliance sitting over here. And again, this is the argument. If you've got a system like that and you're going to invest the time and effort to make sure it's done properly, you're not doing something else. So if we're not going to invest the time here, let's get rid of it so it doesn't create that kind of risk, and we can invest our time deciding what we're going to do properly. And this, I still don't think, particularly from a personal safety perspective, less so from a process safety, but from a personal safety perspective, we're still not very good at criticality in trying to understand this is what's really important and we're going to pay attention to that, and other stuff isn't so important. But that's, we tend to, our priorities in safety tend to swing pretty dramatically, and typically following an incident. So I've had an incident that involves somebody losing the top of their finger. All of a sudden, everything is invested in that. But even then, and you would appreciate this, Nip, and even then somebody loses the tip of their finger, the investment in energy is typically around the mechanics of the loss of the finger. So the equipment, the PPE, the individuals involved. Very seldom, in my experience at least, do you draw back and say, well, what are the broader training, competency, supervision, production pressures, access to resources? Does this loss of a finger, is that representative of, again, to use what I said before, is that representative of a one-off departure from our system, or is there something more systemic under this? We're very good at small snapshots and not holistic views.
Absolutely. I'm just listening to you for the last few minutes. I'm just starting to think that maybe we don't understand. We don't even have a definition of what a process means, because everything that you're suggesting so far is that a process is not so much a documented thing.
No. Yep.
Maybe we need to unpack this whole idea of what is a process.
Or a system, yeah. So the classic one I would give is, when you're a child, you're taught to cross the road. Look to the left, look to the right, look to the left again, you cross the road. That's the system for managing the risk of crossing the road. But it's not documented. You don't fill out a checklist every time you do it. We use systemic approaches or systems or processes, however you want to describe them, to manage everything we do every day. Sometimes we do it without even thinking about it. That's the whole heuristics side of human behaviour. And yet, when it comes to safety, we seem to have this obsession that we have to proceduralise everything. I often talk to organisations when I look at investigations, and I say, well, they say, oh, there wasn't a procedure for this. So that's okay, but did it meet the expectations of the organisation? And it's like, well, hang on, if it's not written down, we don't have an expectation about it. I said, no, that's not right. We all have expectations in every aspect of our life about how our families behave, how our friends will behave, what's socially acceptable, what's not socially acceptable. And organisations are no different.
No.
There's whole lots of things that are never written down, but everybody knows what the rules are. But safety is that area where we think if it's not written down, and I've had this argument with regulators, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. I said, no, that's just nonsense. It's just nonsense. And a lot of, again, it's interesting. So we've just recently had psychosocial regulations published in Australia. Terrible idea, but we've done it. And there's this sort of view that regulation and process, the regulators promote that because it's good for companies. I don't think it is. I think the only entity that benefits from process and regulation is the regulator, because it gives them something to point to. So historically, psychosocial incidents have never really been dealt with by the health and safety regulator in Australia. There are some examples. There have been prosecutions for bullying going back a long while, so it's always been within the framework. It's always been within the capacity of the regulator. But now they've got a set of regulations which says, this is what you must do and these are the factors you must consider. If I'm a regulator, it's very easy to come in and say, well, Regulation 55D4 says you had to consider this. Can you show me where that was considered? And that's what we're going to see, I think. It's mechanistic, it's bureaucratic, it will do nothing for the mental health and well-being of people in the workplace. But it creates a process.
Yeah.
And you would appreciate that from your experience in the maritime industry and the sort of mental stress and psychosocial stress on workers in that industry. But I suspect that then as soon as you say, here is a list of things you must consider, then that's what will be done. The list will be worked through quite independently of the social well-being
of the intent behind it.
Absolutely. Yes, intent behind it gets lost.
Yes.
And you talked before about this idea of not being able to really define process.
But let's just bring it all together to say, maybe summarize it to say, what do you think? Why do you think the spirits of paper safe
Yeah.
have not been understood or embraced in a real sense? And then maybe just summarize it in a few words.
Look, I think it's very hard to summarise or to get a view of it, but I think as I touched on before, I think the role of the regulator has something to do with this. But I think at its heart, Nippon, for reasons I don't understand, and you're probably better placed with your background to have a view on this, I just think organisations have been conditioned for so long in terms of managerial systems that you can only have effective management if it's documented. I just think that is so ingrained and conditional in our organisations that it's so hard to release things.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. When you use the word emotive response, I think there's at a very unconscious level, there is this very strong belief that all I need is a document and everything else can be taken care of.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I know of small businesses who have paid a lot of money for safety management systems, 3 or 4 lever arch files that they've never looked at, never read. Something's gone wrong, and I've had one to me literally say, we just thought we could push these files across the desk and that would be the end of the matter.
I think that's a wonderful place to stop and let people reflect on this idea. But thanks, Greg. That's been a very helpful conversation. Yes.
Thank you.